All he wanted was to quietly restore the old farmhouse he'd inherited and honor the man who raised him. He had no idea his sister-in-law was about to launch a legal war that would expose exactly why you should never underestimate a veteran who knows his rights. David Rodriguez pulled his weathered Chevy Silverado into the gravel driveway of 80 Ford in Maple Ridge Road, the engine ticking as it cooled in the crisp October morning air. At 34, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who'd spent 8 years in the Army Corps of Engineers, building bridges in hostile territory and defusing explosives that could level city blocks. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The farmhouse before him had seen better days: peeling white paint, sagging front porch, gutters hanging at odd angles. But to David, it was perfect. This was the house where his grandfather Miguel Rodriguez had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when he was 7. David stepped out of his truck, his steel-toed work boots crunching on the autumn leaves. He was dressed simply: faded jeans, flannel shirt, baseball cap with a small American flag pin. Nothing about his appearance screamed military veteran or property owner, which was exactly how he preferred it. Reaching into his jacket pocket, David pulled out a folded piece of paper, his grandfather's last letter, written just weeks before the cancer took him. The shaky handwriting still brought tears to his eyes. "Micho, this house has been in our family for 60 years. I bought it with my first paycheck from the factory, dreaming of the family I'd raise here. You were the light of my life after your parents passed. The house is yours now. Make it a home again. Make me proud. Abuelo." David had promised at the funeral that he'd restore every board, every shingle, exactly the way Miguel would have wanted. He'd saved up his military pay for this moment, 6 months of leave approved, contractor's license in his wallet, and a detailed renovation plan sketched out during his final deployment. This wasn't just about a house, it was about honoring the man who'd taught him that hard work and integrity were the only currencies that mattered. Miguel had worked double shifts at the steel mill for 30 years to pay off this mortgage, never missing a payment, even during the recession of '91 when half his friends lost their jobs. The property sat on 3 acres of rolling Pennsylvania countryside, surrounded by maple trees that painted the landscape in brilliant oranges and reds. A red barn stood behind the house, and David could see the vegetable garden his grandfather had tended until his final summer, now overgrown but still showing signs of careful planning. Tomato stakes stood like weathered soldiers, and the raised beds showed the precise construction Miguel had been known for. The nearest neighbor was half a mile down the dirt road, and the only sounds were birds calling and the distant hum of traffic from Route 5. It was the kind of place where a man could work with his hands, think clearly, and find peace after years of military service. David walked the perimeter of the house, making mental notes with the systematic precision his drill sergeants had beaten into him. New roof, complete tear-off and replacement. Foundation repair on the east side where water damage had created settling. Complete electrical update. The old knob and tube wiring was a fire hazard waiting to happen. Probably 8 months of work if he did most of it himself, maybe 6 if he hired help for the heavy structural work. He'd planned to live in the barn while renovating, just like his grandfather had done when he first bought the place in. Miguel had told him stories about those early days, sleeping on an army cot, cooking on a hot plate, taking cold showers from a garden hose. Building something with your hands teaches you what you're really made of. Micho, he'd always. Opening his truck's tailgate, David pulled out his well-worn tool belt and a thermos of coffee his neighbor Mrs. Patterson had insisted he take. She'd been Miguel's friend for 40 years, bringing him casseroles during his final months, and had promised to check on David's progress. His phone buzzed with a text from his army buddy Martinez. "How's civilian life treating you, Rodriguez? Miss getting shot at yet?" David smiled and typed back, "Trading IEDs for electrical work. Much safer explosions." The truth was, he was grateful for the peace. 8 years of military service had given him structure, purpose, and skills most people couldn't imagine. He could wire a building, frame a house, install plumbing, and calculate load-bearing requirements in his head. But it had also cost him relationships, sleep, and a sense of normalcy he was only now beginning to rediscover. All he wanted was 6 months to restore this house, maybe find some local construction work afterward, and build the quiet life his grandfather had always said he deserved. Miguel had seen the way military service had changed David, the way he startled at unexpected sounds, the nightmares that woke him sweating, the difficulty connecting with people who'd never seen real hardship. "This place will heal you," the old man had promised, "just like it healed me after the factory closed." As David unloaded his tools, his military training kept him naturally aware of his surroundings. Old habits died hard. In Iraq, situational awareness had meant the difference between coming home and coming home in a box. He noticed the fresh tire tracks in the driveway, 2 sets, one wider than the other, both recent. Someone had been here recently, and not just one person. The lockbox on the front door had been tampered with, deep scratches around the keyhole suggesting someone had tried different keys, maybe even attempted to pick it. David's jaw tightened. Miguel's lawyer, Mr. Brennan, had mentioned during the will reading that the family wasn't entirely happy about the inheritance, but this looked like more than disappointment. David's older brother Tony had always expected to get the house, despite never visiting Miguel in his final years except to ask for money. Tony's wife Vanessa had made it clear at every family gathering that she thought David was irresponsible and immature for choosing military service over settling down. She'd once told him at Christmas dinner that playing soldier wasn't a real career, and he'd never amount to anything without her husband's guidance. But the will was clear, the deed transfer was legal, and David had the paperwork to prove it. Miguel had been sharp as a tack until the end, and he'd made his choice deliberately. The house went to the grandson who'd actually spent time here, who'd helped with repairs every summer, who'd listened to his stories and learned his values. Still, something felt off. In Iraq, that kind of instinct had saved his life more than once. The hair on the back of his neck stood up the same way it had before insurgent attacks. Here in rural Pennsylvania, it probably just meant dealing with family drama, but David had learned never to ignore his gut feeling. He'd called ahead to let everyone know he was moving in. His brother Tony had been surprisingly quiet on the phone, just muttering something about "we'll see about that," before hanging up. Their sister-in-law Vanessa hadn't returned his calls at all, which wasn't entirely unusual. She'd never liked him, but the silence felt different this time. More calculated. David shrugged it off and headed toward the front door, keys in hand. Whatever family politics were brewing, he had legal ownership and a job to do. Sometimes the best way to handle drama was to simply focus on the work in front of you. Miguel had taught him that too. When people try to bring you down to their level, Mikao, you just keep building something beautiful. He inserted the key into the lock, turned it with a satisfying click, and stepped across the threshold into his inheritance. The house smelled like his grandfather, Old Spice aftershave, coffee, and the faint scent of the wood polish Miguel had used on the furniture every Saturday morning. David smiled, finally feeling at peace for the first time since the funeral. This was home. This was where he belonged. He had no idea that drama was already speeding toward him in a silver BMW, driven by someone who had very different ideas about who deserved to live in Miguel Rodriguez's house. David had been inside for exactly 23 minutes, just long enough to walk through each room and feel the weight of memory in every corner when he heard the crunch of gravel in the driveway. Through the kitchen window he watched a silver BMW X5 pull up aggressively, stopping inches from his truck's bumper in what could only be described as an intimidation tactic. The driver's door flew open, and out stepped Vanessa Rodriguez, his brother Tony's wife of 12 years. Even from a distance, David could see she was dressed for battle, designer jeans, expensive boots, and the kind of jewelry that announced she had money and wasn't afraid to use it as a weapon. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail that seemed to stretch her face into a permanent scowl. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind her emerged Tony, David's older brother by 3 years, looking uncomfortable but determined. Tony had always been the follower in their relationship, Vanessa, made the decisions, and he went along to keep the peace. Where David was lean and weathered from military service, Tony had grown soft from years behind a desk at his insurance agency. But it was the third person who made David's military instincts sharpen. A man in his 50s stepped out of the back seat, expensive suit, briefcase, and the predatory smile of someone who made a living from other people's misfortune. This wasn't just a family visit, this was an organized assault. David walked onto the front porch, his hands loose at his sides, keeping his voice calm and measured. Tony, Vanessa, wasn't expecting you so soon. Vanessa didn't waste time with pleasantries. Don't act surprised, David. We called 3 times yesterday. Her voice carried the sharp edge of someone used to getting her way through sheer volume and persistence. I was driving, David replied evenly. Phone was dead. Got here this morning and figured I'd call you once I got settled. Settled? Vanessa's voice pitched higher, and David recognized the tone. It was the same one she'd used at family gatherings, when she wanted to embarrass someone in front of everyone else. You think you can just waltz in here and take over? Tony stepped forward, looking apologetic but determined. David, we need to talk about the house, about Grandpa's will. The man in the suit moved closer, and David noted the way he positioned himself, slightly to the side, ready to interfere if needed. Miss Rodriguez, the man said, extending a business card. I'm Richard Steinberg, attorney representing Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Rodriguez. We have some concerns about the legitimacy of the will. David took the card but didn't look at it, keeping his eyes on Vanessa. In Iraq, he'd learned that the person making the most noise was usually the most dangerous. The will was filed properly, lawyer, witnesses, everything legal. What's the problem? The problem, Vanessa snapped, stepping closer to the porch, is that Tony was supposed to inherit this house. He's the eldest son, he has a family to provide for, and he actually has a real job. You've been playing soldier for 8 years while he's been building a life. David felt something cold settle in his chest, but his voice remained steady. Miguel made his choice. It's his house to give. Was his house, Vanessa corrected, her voice dripping with venom, and he wasn't in his right mind at the end. Cancer medication, painkillers. Mr. Steinberg says we have grounds to contest. The lawyer nodded, pulling papers from his briefcase. There are questions about undue influence, Rodriguez. Your grandfather's mental state, the timing of the will changes, your presence during his final months, while other family members were kept away. David's jaw tightened. Kept away. Tony visited twice in 2 years. I spent every leave helping Miguel with repairs, taking him to doctor appointments, making sure he ate. Where were you when he needed family? We have jobs, Vanessa shouted, her careful composure cracking. Responsibility. We can't just drop everything and play nursemaid like some unemployed soldier boy. The words hit David like a physical blow, but he'd faced worse from people who actually mattered. I'm not unemployed. I'm transitioning out of military service with an honorable discharge, a contractor's license, and enough savings to restore this place properly. With what money? Vanessa demanded, climbing the porch steps uninvited. Military pay. Please, Tony, and I could actually afford to maintain this property, improve it, make it valuable again. You'll probably turn it into some rundown veteran crash pad. Tony looked uncomfortable with his wife's aggression, but didn't stop her. David, maybe we could work something out. Buy you out, give you enough to start fresh somewhere else. Vanessa's right. We have the resources to really fix this place up. David studied his brother's face, seeing genuine belief there. Tony actually thought he was being generous, offering to buy David out of his own inheritance. It's not for sale, Tony. Everything's for sale, Steinberg interjected smoothly. We're prepared to offer fair market value, minus the cost of necessary repairs, given the condition of the property. Stop. David's voice carried a hint of the authority he'd used, commanding soldier. This conversation is over. I own this house legally. If you want to contest the will, that's your right, but you'll need to do it through the courts. Vanessa's face flushed red with rage. You arrogant little boy. You think because you wore a uniform, you deserve everything handed to you. You don't know what real work is. You don't know what sacrifice means. David looked at her steadily, remembering the nights in Fallujah when he'd defused bombs while insurgents fired at him, the friends he'd lost, the bridges he'd built under impossible conditions. I know enough. No, you don't. Vanessa was fully wound up now, her voice echoing across the quiet countryside. You waltzed off to play war while Tony stayed here, built a business, supported his family, paid taxes, contributed to society, and now you think you can just come back and take what belongs to a real man. She stepped closer, her finger jabbing toward his chest. You know what I think? I think you manipulated a sick old man. I think you filled his head with sob stories about your military service, made him feel guilty, convinced him to change his will. That's elder abuse, David. That's criminal. David's hands remained at his sides, but something shifted in his posture, a subtle change that Tony noticed even if Vanessa didn't. The easygoing little brother was being replaced by something harder, more focused. You need to leave, David said quietly. We're not going anywhere, Vanessa shouted, emboldened by his restraint. This is family property, and family doesn't mean whatever random nephew shows up with a sob story. That's when she made her fatal mistake. Looking directly into David's eyes with pure contempt, she said the words that would haunt her for months to come. You don't deserve to be here. You're nothing but a broken soldier who couldn't make it in the real world. This house belongs to people who actually matter. The autumn air seemed to still around them. Even Steinberg, for all his legal experience, recognized that something fundamental had just shifted in the dynamic. David looked at each of them in turn. The lawyer with his briefcase full of legal threats, Tony with his uncomfortable loyalty, and Vanessa with her absolute certainty that she could bully her way to victory. Then he reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded document, the deed to 100 Maple Ridge Road, with his name clearly printed as the legal owner. Actually, David said, his voice carrying a new edge that made Tony take an involuntary step backward. It belongs to me. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable. David's relaxed posture straightened into something more formal, more commanding. His voice dropped to the calm, measured tone he'd used when briefing generals in Baghdad, quiet authority that demanded attention without raising volume. Miss Steinberg, David said, unfolding the deed with deliberate precision, I assume you've actually read the legal documents before making accusations of elder abuse. The lawyer's confident expression flickered. Something in David's demeanor had changed, and Steinberg was experienced enough to recognize when the dynamics of a situation shifted. Well, yes, but there are always grounds for. Let me save you some time, David interrupted, reaching into his jacket and producing a manila folder that was considerably thicker than Steinberg's briefcase papers. Miguel Rodriguez executed his will on March 5. Present were attorney Thomas Brennan, Harvard Law, 30 years experience in estate planning, Dr. Sarah Chen, Miguel's oncologist, and Father Martinez from St. Catherine's Church. David opened the folder with the systematic precision of someone presenting a mission briefing. Doc Chen's medical records, which I have signed releases for, show Miguel was on minimal pain medication at the time, Tylenol and low-dose morphine, that didn't affect cognitive function. The will was recorded, witnessed, and filed properly with the county clerk. Vanessa's face was reddening, but David continued before she could interrupt. Father Martinez provided a written statement about Miguel's mental clarity during their weekly visit. Miguel discussed his decision extensively, explaining that he wanted the house to go to the grandchild who had actually maintained a relationship with him. David's eyes moved to Tony, the grandchild who visited every month, helped with maintenance, and took care of medical appointments. Steinberg was frantically making notes, clearly realizing his clients hadn't provided him with complete information. That's very thorough, but contested wills are still. Furthermore, David continued, pulling out another document. Miguel recorded a video statement explaining his decision. Would you like to watch it? The lawyer's pen stopped moving. Video testimony from the deceased was nearly impossible to challenge in court, and everyone present knew it. This is ridiculous, Vanessa exploded, her careful legal strategy crumbling. You can have all the paperwork in the world. It doesn't change the fact that you don't deserve this house. You're a nobody, a drifter with PTSD, who manipulated an old man. David's expression didn't change, but Tony noticed his little brother's hands, completely steady, unlike his own, which were starting to shake. In high-stress situations, David had always been the calm one, but this was different. This was professional composure. "Ma'am," David said, his voice taking on the respectful but firm tone he'd used with difficult superior officers. "You're entitled to your opinion about my character. However, you're standing on my property making false accusations. I'm going to need you to leave." "Your property?" Vanessa laughed harshly. "This is family property. Tony's been part of this family longer than you've been alive. He has a wife, children, responsibilities. What do you have?" "Nothing." David pulled out his phone and began recording. "For the record, I'm asking you to leave my property peacefully. This conversation is being recorded." Steinberg immediately stepped forward. "That's unnecessary. We can resolve this civilly." "Can we?" David asked, still recording. "Because your client just accused me of elder abuse, fraud, and manipulation. In Pennsylvania, that's defamation, and since she's doing it to try to intimidate me into giving up legal property, it could also constitute extortion." The lawyer's face went pale. He clearly hadn't expected to deal with someone who understood legal terminology and consequences. "You're bluffing," Vanessa snarled, but her voice had lost some of its edge. "You don't know anything about the law." David smiled for the first time since they'd arrived, not a pleasant expression. "Ma'am, I spent 8 years in military intelligence and engineering. Part of my job was understanding international law, property rights, and rules of engagement. I know exactly what constitutes harassment, trespassing, and intimidation." He took a step forward, and Tony automatically stepped back. "I also know that under Pennsylvania Castle Doctrine, I have the right to defend my property from people who refuse to leave after being asked politely." "Are you threatening us?" Steinberg demanded, trying to regain control of the situation. "I'm informing you of the law," David replied calmly, "which, as an attorney, you should already know." David turned to his brother, his voice softening slightly. "Tony, I understand you're disappointed, but Miguel made his choice for good reasons. If you'd visited more than twice in 2 years, maybe you'd understand why." Tony's face crumpled with shame. "David, I wanted to visit more, but Vanessa said it was too depressing, and with work and the kids." "He doesn't need excuses," Vanessa snapped, rounding on her husband. "Don't you dare apologize to him." But David was looking at Tony with something approaching sympathy. "Miguel understood, Tony. He never blamed you, but he also knew I'd take care of this place the way he would have wanted. This is insane." Vanessa's voice was reaching a pitch that probably disturbed wildlife for miles. "You can't just waltz in here with your military attitude and think you can intimidate us. We have rights too." David nodded thoughtfully. "You absolutely do. You have the right to contest the will in court, though I should mention that doing so frivolously can result in sanctions and attorney fees. You have the right to leave peacefully. What you don't have is the right to harass me on my own property." He looked directly at Steinberg. "Counselor, I'd advise you to research Pennsylvania harassment and defamation laws before proceeding. I have everything documented, recorded, and witnessed." Steinberg was already closing his briefcase. "Mrs. Rodriguez, perhaps we should discuss our options privately." "No." Vanessa was completely unhinged now. "I'm not leaving. This house should belong to people who matter, real people with real lives, not some damaged soldier playing pretend." That's when David reached into his folder one final time and pulled out a letter with official military letterhead. "Since you keep questioning my qualifications," he said conversationally, "this is a commendation from the Secretary of Defense for defusing 17 improvised explosive devices in Fallujah, saving approximately 200 civilian lives." He pulled out another document. "This is my honorable discharge with commendation for 8 years of distinguished service," and another, "This is my contractor's license,
valid, in 3 states, and another. This is a bank statement showing I have sufficient funds to restore this property to better condition than it's been in 40 years. Vanessa stared at the documents, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. Now, David said, his voice returning to that calm, professional tone, I'm going to ask one more time for you to leave my property. If you refuse, I'll call the county sheriff and have you removed for trespassing. If you continue to harass me, I'll file for a restraining order. If you make any more false accusations about my character or my relationship with Miguel, I'll sue you for defamation. He looked at each of them in turn. Those aren't threats, those are promises, and unlike some people, when I make a promise, I keep it. The silence stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Steinberg cleared his throat. Mr. Rodriguez, we'll be in touch through proper legal channel. Tony looked like he wanted to say something, an apology maybe, or an explanation, but Vanessa grabbed his arm and began dragging him toward the car. This isn't over, she shouted over her shoulder. We'll see what a real lawyer says about this. David watched them pile into the BMW, Vanessa still screaming threats through the window as they drove away in a spray of gravel. Only when their taillights disappeared down the country road did David allow himself to relax, his military bearing softening back into the quiet man who just wanted to restore his grandfather's house. He looked down at the deed in his hand, Miguel Rodriguez's final gift to the grandson who'd never forgotten where he came from. Thanks for having my back one more time, Abulal, he said quietly, then headed inside to start the work he'd come here to do.
3 hours later, David was stripping old wallpaper from the dining room when his phone rang. The number was local but unfamiliar. David Rodriguez, Mr. Rodriguez, this is Sheriff Patricia Wells with the County Sheriff's Office. We received a complaint about a possible altercation at your property this morning. Are you available to speak? David set down his putty knife and walked to the front porch. Of course, Sheriff. What kind of complaint? Well, that's what I'm trying to figure out. We got a call from someone claiming you threatened them with violence and illegally recorded a conversation. But then we got another call from a witness saying you handled harassment on your property with remarkable restraint. David smiled slightly. Patterson next door has good eyesight for her age. That she does. Would you mind if I came by? Just to get your side of things on record. I'd appreciate that, actually. Sheriff Wells arrived 20 minutes later in a county patrol car, followed by Mrs. Patterson in her ancient Ford pickup. At 73, Eleanor Patterson had been Miguel's closest neighbor and friend, bringing him soup during his illness and keeping an eye on the property since his death. The sheriff was a woman in her 50s with graying hair, and the calm demeanor of someone who'd dealt with every kind of domestic dispute imaginable. She examined David's documentation while Mrs. Patterson provided colorful commentary. That Vanessa Rodriguez has been a problem for years, Patterson declared, settling into Miguel's old porch swing. Remember when she tried to get the county to force Miguel to cut down his oak tree because it blocked her view when she visited? Which was never, by the way. Sheriff Wells reviewed the video David had recorded, her eyebrows rising as Vanessa's voice grew more shrill. Mr. Rodriguez, you showed considerable restraint here. Most people would have lost their temper after the first 5 minutes. Military training, Sheriff. Staying calm under pressure was part of my job. I can tell. She closed her notepad. For the record, you handled this perfectly. Recording the conversation was legal since you're on your own property and announced you were doing. Their attorney should have known better than to let it escalate this far. Mrs. Patterson snorted. Steinberg's been chasing ambulances for 30 years. He probably took their money without asking the right question. The sheriff's radio crackled, and she answered briefly before turning back to David. Ditching timing. That was dispatch. Seems Mr. Steinberg just called to withdraw the complaint. Apparently, he's advised his clients that pursuing legal action would be inadvisable. Smart lawyer, David said. Smart enough to recognize when he's on the wrong side of a losing case. Sheriff Wells stood to leave. Mr. Rodriguez, welcome to the neighborhood. If you have any more trouble, don't hesitate to call. After she left, Patterson lingered on the porch, her weathered hands folded in her lap. Miguel would be proud, you know. The way you stood up to them without losing your dignity. He taught me that, David said. Stand firm but stay honorable. He used to worry about you boys after he was gone. Especially Tony. Said that wife of his was poison, but love makes people blind. She shook her head sadly. Miguel saw how military service changed you, made you stronger but also more careful with people. He knew you'd take care of this place the right way. That evening, David's phone buzzed with a text from Tony. David, I'm sorry about today. Vanessa convinced me we had legal grounds. I should have known better. Miguel loved you like a son. The house belongs with you. David stared at the message for a long time before responding. Family dinner Sunday. I'll cook Miguel's famous chili recipe. The reply came immediately. I'd like that. Can I bring the kids? They miss their great-grandpa's stories. He'd want them here. Over the following weeks, the story of the confrontation spread through the small community with the speed that only small-town gossip could achieve. The local diner buzzed with accounts of how the quiet veteran had outmaneuvered a team of legal bullies without raising his voice. Frank Morrison, who owned the hardware store in town, started saving military discounts for David after hearing the story. Anyone who can handle family drama that well deserves a break on lumber prices, he declared. The story reached the local American Legion post, where Commander Bill Harrison, a Vietnam veteran, invited David to their monthly meeting. We've got a poker game every Thursday if you're interested, he mentioned. Fair warning though, we mostly tell stories about outsmarting officers and complain about how young people don't know how to work anymore. David found himself laughing for the first time in months. Sounds perfect. Meanwhile, Vanessa Rodriguez was learning some hard lessons about the consequences of public behavior. The video of her screaming at a military veteran had somehow found its way onto social media, shared by someone who'd heard the story at the diner. Comments were not kind. Her real estate business began losing clients who didn't appreciate her treatment of a veteran, trying to honor his grandfather's memory. The local bank, where she and Tony had their business accounts, quietly suggested they might find better service elsewhere after several military families closed their accounts in protest. Tony finally found the courage to tell his wife that her behavior was destroying their reputation and possibly their marriage. The conversation didn't go well, but it was long overdue. 3 weeks after the confrontation, David was installing new electrical outlets in the kitchen when he heard a familiar truck in the driveway. Through the window he saw Tony climbing out alone, carrying a toolbox and wearing work clothes. Thought you might need some help, Tony called out. I took a few days off from work. David opened the front door, studying his brother's face. Tony looked older, more tired, but also more determined than David had seen him in years. What about Vanessa? Tony's smile was rueful. Vanessa is staying with her sister while she reevaluates her priorities. Apparently, that includes whether being married to someone who won't support her legal crusades is worth the effort. I'm sorry, Tony. Don't be. Maybe it's time I remembered what family actually means. Tony hefted his toolbox. Miguel taught me how to use these tools too. Just because I got soft behind a desk doesn't mean I forgot everything. David stepped aside to let his brother enter. Miguel always said this house was big enough for family who wanted to be here. Even family who've been idiots? Especially them, that's what second chances are for. As the brothers worked side by side, restoring the house that had shaped both their childhoods, David realized that Miguel's final gift hadn't just been the property itself. It had been the opportunity to rebuild more than just walls and windows. By Sunday, when Tony's children ran laughing through the rooms where their great-grandfather had told stories, David understood that some battles were worth fighting, not just for victory, but for what victory could restore. The house at 8047 Maple Ridge Road was becoming a home again, filled with the sounds of family and the promise of new memories built on the foundation of old wisdom. Miguel Rodriguez would have been proud indeed. 6 months later, David stood on the newly rebuilt front porch, watching the sunrise paint the Pennsylvania hills in shades of gold and amber. The house behind him was transformed, fresh white paint, new roof, modern electrical and plumbing, hidden behind carefully preserved original woodwork. Every detail had been restored with the meticulous care of someone who understood that some things were worth doing right. The morning air carried the scent of fresh coffee from the kitchen, where Tony was already starting breakfast for his kids who'd spent the night. It had become a tradition, weekend sleepovers at Uncle David's house, where bedtime stories featured their great-grandfather's adventures and morning meant pancakes on the old cast-iron griddle Miguel had used for 60 years. David's phone buzzed with a notification from the contractors forum, where he'd started posting progress photos of the restoration. The project had garnered attention from preservation societies and fellow veterans looking to learn traditional building technique. Comments poured in from across the country, other veterans starting their own restoration projects, inspired by seeing what was possible with patience and skill. Uncle David, 8-year-old Sofia Rodriguez, came running onto the porch in her pajamas, followed by her younger brother Marcus. "Dad says you're gonna teach us how to build the treehouse today." David grinned, ruffling Sofia's hair. "After breakfast and after you help me plant the new tomatoes where Abuelo's garden used to be. Work first, fun second." "That's exactly what Miguel used to say." Tony called from the kitchen doorway, carrying 2 cups of coffee, except he usually added something about character being built through honest labor. The brothers had found their rhythm over the past month. Tony spent most weekends at the house, teaching his children the skills Miguel had taught them: how to use tools properly, how to plant a garden, how to fix things instead of throwing them away. His marriage to Vanessa had officially ended in February, a divorce that surprised no one who knew them, but relieved everyone who cared about Tony's happiness. Sheriff Wells called yesterday, Tony mentioned, settling into one of the new porch chairs David had built from reclaimed barn wood. "Thought you'd want to know, Vanessa's moving to Florida. Something about a fresh start and toxic small-town attitudes." David sipped his coffee thoughtfully. "How do you feel about that?" Relieved, honestly, the kids asked if they had to go with her. Tony's voice carried a mixture of sadness and resolve. "I told them they could choose. They want to stay here close to family and friends." Vanessa, well, she said that proved they'd been poisoned against her by all of. "Some people never learn that respect is earned, not demanded," David observed. The sound of another vehicle in the driveway interrupted their conversation. Mrs. Patterson's ancient pickup pulled up, followed by a newer Honda driven by Dr. Sarah Chen, Miguel's former oncologist. The doctor had become a regular visitor, drawn by David's stories about Miguel's final months in the transformation of the property. "Morning, boys," Mrs. Patterson called out, carrying a covered dish that undoubtedly contained her famous cinnamon rolls. "Brought sustenance for the work crew." Dr. Chen approached with a manila folder and a smile. "David, I have something I think you'll appreciate. The hospital's medical ethics board reviewed your grandfather's case file after hearing about the will contest. They've written an official letter confirming Miguel's mental competency throughout his treatment. Thought you might want it for your records." David accepted the letter gratefully, not planning to need it, but it's good to have. "The board was actually impressed by the documentation you provided during the legal challenge," Dr. Chen continued. "They're considering using your case as an example of how to properly document patient autonomy in end-of-life decisions." Tony looked puzzled. "Documentation?" David pulled out his phone and showed his brother a folder containing dozens of voice recordings. "Every conversation I had with Miguel about his plans for the house, every discussion about the will changes, every time he explained his reasoning. You recorded all of." "Military habit," David explained. "In intelligence work, you learn that memories can be questioned, but recordings don't lie. Miguel actually suggested it after the first time you and Vanessa questioned his decisions." Dr. Chen nodded approvingly. "Your grandfather was sharper than people gave him credit for. He knew exactly what he was doing and why." The morning was interrupted by the arrival of Commander Harrison from the American Legion, driving his vintage Jeep and wearing his usual collection of military patches. Behind him came Frank Morrison from the hardware store, his truck loaded with lumber for the treehouse project. "David," Commander Harrison called out, "hope you don't mind the invasion." Word got out about the treehouse project and half the post volunteered to help. Soon the property was bustling with activity. Veterans ranging in age from their 20s to their 80s worked alongside Tony's children, measuring, cutting and assembling what would become the most structurally sound treehouse in Pennsylvania history. The project had taken on a life of its own, becoming a community effort, that brought together multiple generations of service members. Dr. Chen found herself drafted into the gardening crew, where Miss Patterson was directing the planting of Miguel's memorial garden, a carefully planned space featuring his favorite vegetables and the roses he'd grown for his late wife. "This is exactly what Miguel envisioned," Miss Patterson said, watching Sophia carefully place tomato seedlings in the rich soil. Not just the house restored, but the family restored too. As the day progressed, David found himself standing in the same spot where he'd confronted Vanessa 6 months earlier. The transformation was remarkable, not just of the property, but of the relationships that had grown from that difficult day. His phone rang and he was surprised to see Steinberg's number on the display. "Mr. Rodriguez, this is Richard Steinberg. I hope you don't mind me calling." David stepped away from the crowd. "What can I do for you, Mr. Steinberg? I wanted to apologize for my role in that unfortunate situation last year. I should have done more research before taking the case." The lawyer's voice carried genuine regret. "I also wanted to let you know that I've been following your restoration project through the local news. It's impressive work. Thank you. Actually, I'm calling because I have a potential client, another veteran dealing with a family property dispute, similar circumstances to yours. Would you be willing to share your documentation methods, how you protected yourself legally?" David considered the request. "Send me the details. If someone's trying to cheat a veteran out of legitimate inheritance, I'm happy to help. There's one more thing," Steinberg continued. "Miss Rodriguez, Vanessa, she asked me to pass along a message. She said to tell you that she realizes now that you were right about the house belonging to someone who would take care of it properly." David was quiet for a moment. "Thank you for passing that along." After ending the call, David rejoined the celebration on his property. The treehouse was taking shape, the garden was planted, and the sound of laughter filled the air where angry voices had once echoed. Tony approached with a beer and a satisfied grin. "Kids are asking if they can have their birthday parties here from now on. This house was built for family celebrations," David replied. Miguel would want it filled with kids and laughter. As the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills, David stood on his porch surrounded by the community he'd found, not just inherited, but earned through patience, dignity and the wisdom Miguel had taught him about doing what's right even when it's difficult. The house at Adivord Road had become exactly what Miguel had envisioned, a home where family gathered, where values were taught, and where the next generation learned that some things, integrity, respect and love, were worth fighting for. In his pocket, David still carried Miguel's final letter, now creased and worn from months of reading, but he no longer needed the words to remember the lesson. Home isn't just a place you inherit, it's a place you build, day by day, with the people who choose to stand beside you. The restoration was complete, but the real work, the work of building a life worth living, was just beginning. 1 year after the confrontation that had changed everything, David Rodriguez found himself standing before a packed auditorium at Penn State University's School of Architecture. The invitation to speak had come from Professor Janet Walsh, who had been following his restoration project through social media and professional journals. "When we talk about historic preservation," David said to the audience of students and faculty, "we're not just talking about maintaining buildings, we're talking about preserving the stories, the values and the connections that make a house into a home." Behind him, a projection screen showed before and after photos of Adivord Road. The transformation was dramatic, from a deteriorating farmhouse to a pristine example of mid-century rural architecture, restored with both modern efficiency and historical accuracy. "My grandfather, Miguel Rodriguez, bought this house in 1963 with his first paycheck from the steel mill. He raised his family there, buried his wife from that front porch, and spent his final years teaching his grandson that some things are worth fighting for." David's voice carried the quiet authority that had become his trademark in speaking engagements. A student raised her hand. "Mr. Rodriguez, how did you handle the legal challenges to your inheritance? We've heard rumors about family conflict." David smiled, remembering the advice Commander Harrison had given him about public speaking.
Tell the truth, but focus on the lessons, not the drama. Family disagreements about inheritance are unfortunately common, David replied diplomatically. The key is documentation. Keep records, understand your legal rights, and remember that property disputes are often really about deeper issues: respect, fairness, and different ideas about what family means. After his presentation, David was approached by Maria Santos, a young veteran who had recently returned from deployment in Syria. Mr. Rodriguez, I inherited my grandmother's house in Texas, but my cousins are threatening to contest the will. They say I don't deserve it because I've been playing soldier instead of staying home and contributing to the family. David's expression hardened slightly. He'd heard variations of this story dozens of times over the past year. Do you have documentation of your grandmother's mental competency when she made the will? I think so. She recorded videos explaining her decisions. Good. Get copies of everything: medical records, witness statements, communications with family members. And Maria. David handed her his business card. Call me next week. I've been working with a network of attorneys who specialize in helping veterans protect their inheritance rights. The Rodriguez Documentation Project, as it had come to be known, had grown far beyond David's original intent to protect himself. Working with legal aid societies and veteran organizations, he'd helped create a template for documenting end-of-life decisions that protected elderly people's wishes, while providing legal protection for their chosen heirs. The project had gained national attention when Senator Patricia Coleman, chair of the Senate Veterans Affairs Committee, cited David's case during hearings about inheritance harassment, a growing problem where family members used legal intimidation to challenge legitimate wills, particularly targeting veterans whose military service had kept them away from home. The Rodriguez case shows us that our veterans shouldn't have to fight legal battles on the home front. After sacrificing for our country abroad, Senator Coleman had declared, "We're introducing legislation to protect service members' inheritance rights and provide legal resources for veterans facing frivolous will contests." Back in Pennsylvania, the impact of David's story continued to spread through the community in unexpected ways. The local high school had invited him to speak to students about conflict resolution and standing up for principles. His message was simple but powerful. Sometimes doing the right thing requires courage, but it always requires preparation. Tony Rodriguez had found his own path forward in the year since his divorce, working weekends with David on various restoration projects around the county. He'd discovered a passion for historic preservation that led him to change career. He was now a certified historic building inspector, helping other families navigate the complex process of restoring old properties. I spent 15 years in an office, thinking that was success, Tony told a reporter from the local newspaper who was writing a follow-up story about the Rodriguez family. Turns out success is working with your hands, preserving something meaningful, and teaching your kids that family isn't about what you inherit. It's about what you build together. The children, Sophia and Marcus, had become regular fixtures at community events, proudly explaining the restoration techniques they'd learned from their uncle and father. Sophia, now 9, had announced her intention to become an architect specializing in historic preservation. Marcus, 7, was still deciding between construction work and veterinary medicine, but either way he planned to fix things that are broken. Mrs. Patterson, now 74, had become something of a local celebrity. As the neighbor who witnessed the confrontation that started it all, she was frequently invited to town meetings and community events to share her perspective on the importance of supporting veterans and standing up to bullies. Miguel Rodriguez raised that boy right, she would tell anyone who would listen. David could have handled that situation with anger, but instead he handled it with intelligence and dignity. That's the difference between a real man and someone who just talks loud. The American Legion Post had seen its membership grow by 40% in the year since David's story became public. Young veterans, inspired by the way the community had rallied around one of their own, began attending meetings and volunteering for community projects. Commander Harrison credited David's example with helping bridge the gap between older and younger veterans. David showed our younger members that civilian communities will support veterans who get involved and contribute, Harrison explained. And he showed our older members that the new generation of veterans has the same values we do. They just express them differently. The hardware store owner, Frank Morrison, had started a program offering discounts to veterans working on home restoration projects. David proved that veterans have the skills and dedication to tackle big projects, Morrison said. Supporting them isn't just good business, it's good for the whole community. Even the story's antagonist had found an unexpected resolution. Vanessa Rodriguez, now living in Florida, had sent a letter to the local newspaper acknowledging her mistake and apologizing for her behavior. The letter, published 6 months after the confrontation, read in part, "I let my emotions and sense of entitlement cloud my judgment." David Rodriguez handled a difficult situation with more grace and maturity than I did. I hope my public apology can serve as a lesson to others about the importance of treating veterans with the respect they've earned. The letter had sparked discussion in online military forums about forgiveness and second chances, with many veterans sharing their own stories of family conflicts and eventual reconciliation. Sarah Chen had used David's case to develop new protocols at the hospital for documenting patient decision-making capacity in end-of-life situations. The Rodriguez documentation became a gold standard for protecting patient autonomy, she explained to medical students. It shows how proper documentation can prevent family conflicts and ensure that a person's final wishes are respected. As David drove home from his speaking engagement at Penn State, his truck radio played a call-in show where listeners were discussing veteran issues. A caller identified himself as Tom, from Harrisburg, and shared his story. "I was inspired by that guy David Rodriguez who stood up to his family's legal harassment. When my brother tried to contest our dad's will, I used the same documentation method. Turned out my brother's lawyer dropped the case as soon as he saw how prepared I was." David smiled, thinking about Miguel's letter still folded in his wallet. His grandfather had wanted the house to go to someone who would take care of it, but Miguel's real gift had been the example of how to live with integrity, standing firm when necessary, showing mercy when possible, and always focusing on what truly mattered. The house at 80 Fort Haven Maple Ridge Road was just the beginning. The real restoration had been of the idea that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, creates ripples that spread far beyond what anyone can imagine. As David pulled into his driveway, he saw Tony's truck already there, along with several other vehicles belonging to volunteers working on their latest project, restoring the community center where Miguel had served on the board for 20 years. Some buildings hold our past, some people shape our future, and sometimes, when you're very lucky, you get to be part of both.
"Uncle David," he said, "if the Rodriguez model works so well, why don't we just make it the law everywhere? Why wait for communities to volunteer?" David smiled, remembering his grandfather's patient approach to teaching difficult lessons. "Because real change has to come from inside, Miguel. Laws can force people to follow rules, but they can't force people to change their hearts. The Rodriguez model only works when communities choose to embrace it, because they believe it's right." Tony Rodriguez, now 67 and serving as the foundation's elder statesman, nodded in agreement. Miguel's letter worked because it came from love, not from authority. That's what makes the community transformations so powerful. They're choosing to honor military families because they've learned to see service as love, not abandonment. As the evening wound down and the extended Rodriguez family prepared to return to their various roles around the world, David felt a familiar sense of completion. The vision young Miguel had articulated 5 years earlier was becoming reality. Communities were learning to protect themselves, to value service, and to ensure that the vulnerable were never left to face harassment alone. The work wasn't finished. 50 pilot communities out of thousands in America, and a handful of international projects out of the millions of communities worldwide. But the proof of concept was complete. Miguel Rodriguez's simple desire to leave his house to someone who would take care of it properly had become a global movement for communities that would take care of everyone properly. The transformation had begun, and like all the best transformations, it was spreading not through force or mandate, but through the irresistible power of an idea whose time had finally come. 35 years after Miguel Rodriguez sealed his final letter, the world had changed in ways that would have seemed like science fiction to anyone present during that first confrontation on the farmhouse porch. What began as one grandfather's simple wish had become humanity's new understanding of how communities could protect their most vulnerable members. The Global Community Transformation Summit, held at the Rodriguez International Center, drew representatives from 20 presidents, prime ministers, military leaders, and community organizers gathered not just to celebrate success, but to grapple with an unprecedented challenge. The Rodriguez model had worked so well that traditional inheritance law was becoming obsolete. David Rodriguez, now 69 and bearing the dignified bearing of someone who had spent 4 decades in service to principles larger than himself, opened the summit with words that would be quoted for generations. "My grandfather wanted his house to go to someone who would take care of it properly. Today, we gather because entire nations want their futures to go to people who will take care of them properly." The statistics were staggering. In the 5 years since the Community Transformation Initiative had expanded globally, inheritance disputes involving military families had decreased by 94%. More remarkably, communities implementing the full Rodriguez model had seen dramatic improvements in social cohesion, economic stability, and mental health outcomes. Yuki Tanaka from Tokyo University presented research showing that Rodriguez communities had 67% lower rates of elder abuse, 43% fewer family law disputes, and 78% higher levels of trust between neighbors. The Rodriguez effect extends far beyond inheritance protection, Dr. Tanaka explained. Communities that learn to respect military service and document family wishes develop stronger social bonds across all demographics. The summit's most dramatic moment came when President Elena Vasquez of Mexico announced that her nation was becoming the first country to officially adopt the Rodriguez principles as the foundation of its family law system. "The evidence is overwhelming," President Vasquez declared. Communities that embrace documentation, respect for service, and protection of the vulnerable don't just prevent inheritance disputes, they prevent social breakdown itself. The announcement sparked what observers would later call the Rodriguez Rush, a competitive race among nations to implement the model most effectively. Within 6 months, 23 countries had passed legislation incorporating Rodriguez principles into their legal framework. The European Union established the Rodriguez Institute for Social Cohesion. The African Union created the Rodriguez Protocol for Conflict Prevention. But perhaps the most significant development was taking place in the United States, where Congress was debating the most comprehensive military family protection legislation in American history. The National Service Honor Act, sponsored by Senator Miguel Rodriguez Washington Jr. Young Miguel Washington's father, now a rising political star, would make the Rodriguez model the standard for how America treated all its service members. 35 years ago, my grandfather stood on a farmhouse porch and defended his inheritance with nothing but documentation and dignity, Senator Washington testified before the Armed Services Committee. Today, we have the opportunity to ensure that no American who serves their country will ever face the harassment he endured. The legislation passed with unprecedented bipartisan support, 98-2 in the Senate, and 420. Sarah Chen's daughter and the first Asian American president signed it into law at a ceremony held on the original Rodriguez property, with David, Tony, and the extended Rodriguez family in attendance. Young Miguel Washington, now 18 and preparing to enter West Point, like his uncle Marcus before him, served as one of the ceremony's speakers. His words captured the generational transformation that had taken place. "My great-great-grandfather wrote a letter about keeping promises. Today, America is making a promise to keep faith with everyone who serves." The global transformation hadn't been without challenges. Some communities resisted change, clinging to traditional hierarchies that privileged physical presence over service. Others worried that the Rodriguez model was creating a military aristocracy that gave unfair advantages to service members. These concerns were addressed by Dr. Rachel Martinez, the Foundation's Director of Ethical Implementation, who had spent years studying the model's effect. The Rodriguez principles don't privilege military families, she explained in her landmark study. They protect vulnerable populations, and military families are vulnerable specifically because their service often takes them away from home during critical family moments. Her research showed that communities implementing the Rodriguez model had also seen dramatic improvements in protection for other vulnerable groups: elderly people facing family pressure, disabled individuals whose care decisions were being questioned, and immigrants whose cultural practices were being dismissed by relatives seeking control of family assets. The model's success had even influenced how businesses operate. The Rodriguez standard became a mark of ethical excellence for law firms, with clients specifically seeking attorneys who had been trained in Rodriguez protocols. Companies began offering Rodriguez benefits, enhanced support for employees with family members in military service, comprehensive documentation assistance, and conflict resolution services. The transformation was perhaps most visible in how children were being raised. The Rodriguez generation, young people who had grown up in communities implementing the model, showed remarkable characteristics: higher levels of empathy, stronger respect for service and sacrifice, and an intuitive understanding of how to document and protect family relationships. Educational systems worldwide began incorporating Rodriguez principles into their curricula. The Letters to the Future program, inspired by Miguel's original letter, had students write letters to their future families explaining their values and wishes. These letters, properly witnessed and documented, were creating a generation of young people who understood instinctively how to protect their intentions and honor their elders. The evening before the summit's conclusion, David found himself walking through Miguel's memorial garden with his great-nephew Miguel Washington. The young man, tall and serious-minded like his uncle Marcus, was grappling with the weight of carrying the family name into the future. "Uncle David," Miguel said, "sometimes I wonder if we've made this too big. Great-great-grandfather just wanted his house to go to the right person. Now we're changing how the whole world thinks about family." David smiled, remembering similar conversations with Tony decades earlier. Miguel wrote that letter because he believed in keeping promises and taking care of family. "What we've built isn't bigger than that. It's just a bigger understanding of what family means." They paused at the bronze statue of Miguel, now surrounded by similar statues honoring military families from around the world. The garden had become an international pilgrimage site, with over 2 million visitors annually coming to see where the global transformation had begun. "The beautiful thing," David continued, "is that we're not forcing anyone to change. We're just showing them what's possible when communities choose to live by the values Miguel believed in: respect, preparation, and taking care of each other properly." As they walked back toward the house, Miguel Washington asked the question that would define the next phase of the movement: what happens when we've transformed every community? When the Rodriguez model is just normal? David considered the question carefully. "Then we'll have succeeded completely." The goal was never to make the Rodriguez name famous. It was to make Rodriguez principles so normal that no one thinks twice about protecting military families, documenting family wishes, and treating service as an expression of love. The summit concluded with the signing of the Global Rodriguez Accord, a non-binding international agreement committing nations to support military families and protect vulnerable populations through proper documentation and community support. 127 countries signed immediately, with the remainder expected to join within the year. As delegates returned to their home countries, they carried with them not just policy recommendations, but a transformed understanding of what communities could become when they embraced the simple principles Miguel Rodriguez had lived by. The ripple that began with one letter had become an ocean of change, washing over communities worldwide and leaving them stronger, more protective of their vulnerable members, and more united in their commitment to honoring those who serve. In hotel rooms and airport lounges around the world, Delegates called their families to say the words that had become the unofficial motto of the Rodriguez movement. I love you, and I'm documenting this conversation to make sure you always know how much you mean to me. The transformation was no longer beginning, it was complete, embedded so deeply in human consciousness that it would protect itself across generations. Miguel Rodriguez's house had indeed gone to someone who would take care of it properly. But more than that, his values had gone to a world that would take care of everyone properly, forever. 40 years after Miguel Rodriguez wrote his final letter, David Rodriguez stood in the same spot where his grandfather had once worked late into the evening, carefully crafting words that would change the world. But tonight, David wasn't alone. The original farmhouse study had become a place of pilgrimage for leaders from every continent, each seeking to understand how one man's simple wish had transformed human civilization itself. The occasion was bittersweet, David's formal retirement from all foundation activities on his After 4 decades of service, he was finally ready to do what his grandfather had always dreamed of, simply tend the garden, read books on the front porch, and watch his family carry forward the values that had started it all. The retirement ceremony was attended by dignitaries whose presence would have been unimaginable 40 years earlier. President Miguel Washington, young Miguel, now 23 and the youngest president in American history, had flown in specifically to honor the man who had shaped his understanding of service and sacrifice. Uncle David, President Washington said during his remarks, "You taught our family that the highest form of patriotism isn't waving flags or making speeches, it's the quiet work of protecting those who cannot protect themselves." The transformation of American politics itself had been one of the Rodriguez model's most unexpected consequences. Military families, no longer forced to choose between service and family stability, had begun entering public service in unprecedented numbers. The result was a generation of leaders who understood both sacrifice and compromise, leading to the most collaborative and effective government in decades. Secretary of Defense Sofia Rodriguez Chen, now 46 and widely regarded as the most effective military leader of her generation, spoke about the personal impact of growing up in the shadow of the Rodriguez story. "My uncle didn't just save our family's house," she said. "He saved our family's soul by showing us that doing the right thing, even when it's difficult, creates ripples that never end." The international delegations present represented a world transformed beyond recognition. The European Federation had restructured its entire approach to military families based on Rodriguez principles. The African Continental Alliance had eliminated inheritance disputes through comprehensive documentation programs. The Asian Cooperation Accord had made respect for military service a cornerstone of trade relationships. But perhaps the most remarkable presence was that of Dr. Vanessa Rodriguez Patterson, now 72, and serving as the Global Institute for Family Reconciliation's Director Emerit. Her transformation from antagonist to advocate had become legendary, inspiring thousands of people to examine their own prejudices and grow beyond them. 40 years ago I stood on this very porch and said terrible things to a good man, Patterson said, her voice steady despite the emotion of the moment. "I spent years in therapy learning that my anger wasn't about inheritance, it was about my own fear that military service somehow diminished the value of civilian life. David taught me that all service has value, whether it's defending democracy overseas or raising children at home." Her reconciliation work had become a model for healing family divisions worldwide. The Patterson Protocol, as it was known, had successfully reunited over 100,000 families torn apart by inheritance disputes, custody battles, and military-civilian cultural misunderstandings. The evening's most moving moment came when Mrs. Patterson's great-great-granddaughter, 5-year-old Elena Patterson Washington, presented David with a hand-drawn picture of the original farmhouse surrounded by all the buildings that had grown around it. At the bottom, in crayon letters that would have made Miguel smile, she had written, "Thank you for taking care of everything properly." As the formal ceremonies concluded and the international delegations departed, David found himself alone on the front porch with Tony, now 72 and moving slowly but still sharp as ever. The brothers had spent 4 decades working side by side, transforming their personal family healing into a global movement for justice and reconciliation.
Remember when our biggest worry was whether Vanessa would convince a judge that Miguel was incompetent? Tony asked, settling into the rocking chair Miguel had built 60 years earlier. David smiled, feeling the weight of 4 decades of advocacy settling into something approaching peace. I remember thinking that if we could just keep the house, we'd have. I never imagined we'd end up changing how the world thinks about family. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Colonel Elena Rodriguez Martinez, Marcus's daughter and the newest member of the family to enter military service. At 28, she commanded an engineering unit that built schools and hospitals in post-conflict zones, using sustainable techniques pioneered at the Rodriguez Center. Grandfather David, she said, using the honorary title the entire extended family had adopted, I have news from the field. The village in Bosnia where we built the community center, they've implemented their own version of the Rodriguez model. They're calling it the Martinez method, in honor of our family name there. The news was emblematic of how the Rodriguez story had evolved. Communities worldwide were adapting the core principles to their own cultural context, creating local variations that honored the fundamental commitment to protecting vulnerable populations, while respecting regional traditions and customs. James Chen Washington, the Foundation's current director and President Washington's cousin, had documented over 2,000 such adaptations worldwide. Each maintained the essential elements: documentation, respect for service, community support for military families, and protection of the vulnerable, while expressing them through local customs and legal framework. As the evening deepened and the extended family gathered for what had become a monthly tradition, David reflected on the question that had been on his mind for years: had they succeeded too well? The Rodriguez model had become so thoroughly integrated into global culture that inheritance harassment of military families was now virtually unthinkable in most of the world. Young Elena Rodriguez Martinez asked the question that crystallized everyone's thoughts. Grandfather David, what happens to the foundation when there are no more families to help? David considered the question carefully, remembering similar conversations with previous generations of the family. The foundation's work will evolve, Elena. Maybe we'll focus on other vulnerable populations. Maybe we'll work on preventing conflicts before they start. Or maybe we'll do what Miguel always dreamed of: simply live quietly and trust that the values we've planted will grow on their own. The idea of success being measured by obsolescence had become central to Rodriguez's philosophy. The ultimate goal was never to create a permanent advocacy organization, but to embed values so deeply in human culture that advocacy became unnecessary. Tony nodded thoughtfully. Miguel always said the best teachers are the ones who make themselves unnecessary, by teaching students to think for themselves. As the family prepared to head inside for dinner, David took one last look at the memorial garden where Miguel's statue stood, surrounded by tributes from military families worldwide. The bronze plaque at the base had been updated earlier that year to include a simple addition: mission accomplished. But David knew that wasn't quite accurate. The mission wasn't accomplished. It had become self-perpetuating. The values Miguel had lived by were now so deeply embedded in human consciousness that they would continue protecting vulnerable families, long after everyone who remembered the original confrontation had passed away. President Washington pulled his uncle aside for a private moment. Uncle David, I need to tell you something. Next week, I'm announcing the dissolution of the Department of Military Family Affairs. Not because we're abandoning military families, but because their protection has become so integrated into every government department that a separate agency is no longer necessary. David felt a surge of pride mixed with profound completion. The ultimate success of any advocacy movement was to make itself unnecessary by solving the problems it was created to address. Miguel would be proud, David said simply. Miguel would be amazed. President Washington replied. I don't think even he could have imagined that his letter would lead to this. As the family gathered around Miguel's old dining table for dinner, David realized that this was exactly what his grandfather had envisioned when he wrote about making the house a home again. Not just the physical structure but the values it represented: love, documentation, respect for service, and protection of the vulnerable, had become home for families around the world. The circle was complete, but the story would continue forever, carried forward by everyone who understood that taking care of things properly wasn't just about houses or inheritance, it was about taking care of each other, properly, always. 50 years, half a century had passed since Miguel Rodriguez picked up his pen to write his final letter. On this golden October morning, as autumn painted the Pennsylvania hills in the same brilliant colors, Miguel had loved David Rodriguez sat on the front porch of the farmhouse where it all began. At 84, David moved with the careful deliberation of age, but his eyes remained clear and sharp. In his weathered hands, he held not Miguel's original letter, that now resided in the Smithsonian as one of the most influential documents in American history, but something far more precious, a letter addressed to him, written in the shaky handwriting of his 5-year-old great-great-niece. Dear Grandpa David, the letter began, Mommy says you're sad because you think your work is done, but I think your work is just beginning to be everywhere forever. Love, Elena. The child's innocent wisdom brought tears to David's eyes, because she was absolutely right. The work wasn't done, it had become infinite, embedded so deeply in the fabric of human consciousness, that it would protect families until the end of time. The mailbox at the end of the driveway no longer bore the name Rodriguez. In a decision that had stunned the world, David had legally changed the property's designation to Humanity House, symbolically transferring ownership from one family to the entire human family. The deed now read, this property belongs to everyone who believes in taking care of each other properly. President Elena Rodriguez Washington, young Elena, now 30 and the first member of the fifth generation to lead the nation, had visited the previous week to discuss the most remarkable development in the story's long evolution, the complete disappearance of inheritance harassment worldwide. Uncle David, she had said, using the honorary title that had replaced all formal distinctions in the Rodriguez family, the UN's Global Family Justice Commission, released their annual report. For the third consecutive year, there were 0 reported cases of inheritance harassment involving military families anywhere on Earth. 0. The achievement was so unprecedented that sociologists struggled to find historical parallel. An entire category of human conflict had simply vanished, not through legislation or enforcement, but through the organic evolution of human values. Marcus Chen Washington, director of the Institute for Ethical Evolution, had spent his career studying how the Rodriguez transformation had occurred. His conclusion was both simple and profound. When you demonstrate that doing the right thing creates better outcomes for everyone, people choose to do the right thing. The Rodriguez family didn't change laws, they changed hearts. The global transformation was now so complete that children growing up couldn't comprehend a world where military families might be harassed for their service. In schools worldwide, the concept had to be explained as an historical curiosity, like slavery, or the denial of voting rights to women, something that once existed, but was now literally unthinkable. The morning's peace was interrupted by the arrival of a young woman in military uniform, carrying a folder that David immediately recognized. Captain Sarah Kim, 25, was the great-granddaughter of the PBS producer, who had first documented the Rodriguez story. But unlike the thousands of similar visits over the decades, this one was different. Mr. Rodriguez, Captain Kim said, I'm not here because my family is being harassed, I'm here because of what didn't happen. David raised an eyebrow. My grandmother passed last month, Captain Kim continued. She left me her house and her business. My cousins were initially upset. They thought they deserved it more because they stayed closer to home while I was serving overseas. But then something remarkable happened. She opened her folder and pulled out a letter signed by 15 family members. They wrote this. It says they realized that my military service was actually the highest form of family service, protecting the freedom that allows families to exist safely. They apologized for their initial reaction, and asked how they could support me in honoring grandmother's wishes. David felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced decades earlier when he first realized that individual transformation could become universal transformation. The Rodriguez effect, Captain Kim continued, isn't just that people don't harass military families anymore, it's that they can't even imagine doing it. The neural pathways for that kind of thinking seem to have been erased from human consciousness. After Captain Kim left, David walked slowly through the memorial garden where Miguel's statue stood, surrounded by tributes from every nation on earth. The bronze plaque now bore an edition that had been voted on by the United Nations General Assembly. Miguel Rodriguez, 1932–2022. He taught humanity that love, when properly documented and courageously defended, becomes eternal. The afternoon brought the weekly gathering of the Rodriguez Family Council, not just blood relatives, but the extended family of advocates, leaders, and ordinary people, whose lives had been shaped by Miguel's simple letter. Today's meeting included participants from 6 continents, all connected by video conference, to the original farmhouse. The agenda was unlike any in the council's 50-year history, planning for their own dissolution. The foundation has served its purpose, announced Dr. James Martinez Chen, the current Director General. Military families are protected not by advocacy organizations, but by the fundamental decency that now characterizes human relationships. We have achieved what Miguel wanted, a world where his values are so normal they don't need defender. The decision to dissolve the Rodriguez Foundation, after 50 years of service, was not made lightly, but it reflected the ultimate measure of success, becoming unnecessary by solving the problems they were created to address. Young Elena Rodriguez Washington, participating from the White House, offered the perspective of the generation that would inherit this transformed world. Great-great-grandfather Miguel's letter wasn't just about inheritance. It was about legacy, not what we leave behind, but what we plant that will grow long after we're gone. As the meeting concluded, and the global family said their farewells, David found himself alone with the ghosts of memory and the weight of completion. He pulled out his phone and did something he'd done every evening for 50 years. He called his brother Tony. But Tony had passed peacefully the previous spring at 82, surrounded by children and grandchildren who understood that family was not just about blood, but about shared values and mutual protection. David's call now went to Tony's son, Colonel David Rodriguez Martinez, who answered with the greeting that had become traditional in the family. "Rodriguez house, we're here to help. I just wanted to hear the words one more time," David said simply. That evening, as the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills exactly as it had 50 years earlier, David sat in Miguel's old rocking chair and opened the worn journal where he'd recorded every significant moment of the journey that began with one letter and ended with humanity transformed. The final entry would be simple: "Today we proved that Miguel was right. When you take care of things properly, they take care of themselves forever." But before he could write those words, a car pulled into the driveway. From it emerged a young man in civilian clothes, carrying a manila folder and wearing the uncertain expression of someone facing an impossible situation. "Mr. Rodriguez," the young man called out, "my name is Michael Thompson. I'm not military, but I heard you help families facing inheritance disputes. My grandfather left me his farm, but my uncle is claiming the will is invalid, because I chose to be a teacher instead of taking over the family business. He says I abandoned my responsibility." David smiled, recognizing the eternal pattern. The specifics changed, but the underlying truth remained constant. In every generation, in every family, there would always be those who needed protection from those who confused power with righteousness.
20 years after David Rodriguez first pulled into the driveway at 847 Maple Ridge Road, the story had transcended its humble origins to become something extraordinary, a living testament to the power of principle over convenience, preparation over intimidation, and love over greed. The milestone anniversary was marked not with a single celebration, but with a week-long festival that drew visitors from around the world. The small Pennsylvania town that had once been known only for its steel mill and farmland now hosted diplomats, military leaders, legal scholars, and families whose lives had been touched by the movement that began with one grandfather's simple letter. David Rodriguez, now 54 and bearing the quiet dignity of someone who had spent 2 decades in service to others, stood before an international audience that included representatives from NATO countries implementing their own versions of the Rodriguez Protocol. His temples were silver now, and his hands bore the calluses of someone who still spent his mornings working in Miguel's memorial garden before heading to foundation meetings. 20 years ago, David began, his voice carrying across the audience through simultaneous translation into 15 languages. My grandfather wrote a letter about keeping promises and taking care of family. Today we see how those simple words have grown into a global conversation about respect, dignity, and the obligations we owe to those who serve. In the front row sat an extraordinary collection of people whose presence told the complete story of transformation. There was Vanessa Rodriguez, now 62 and serving as the foundation's Director of Family Reconciliation. Her own journey from antagonist to advocate, having inspired countless others to examine their own prejudices and grow beyond them. Beside her sat General Sofia Rodriguez Chen, now 31 and the youngest general in Army history, having revolutionized military family support programs while completing her doctorate in conflict resolution. Her marriage to Dr. James Chen, a military psychiatrist, had been celebrated at the Rodriguez Center 3 years earlier, with David walking her down the aisle in Miguel's memory. Colonel Marcus Rodriguez, 29, had just returned from a deployment where he'd used engineering skills learned from his uncle to build schools and hospitals in war-torn regions. His own foundation, Building Bridges, had constructed over 200 community centers worldwide, each incorporating sustainable design principles Sofia had pioneered. Tony Rodriguez, now 57 and serving as the foundation's chairman emeritus, had spent the past 5 years writing the definitive biography of his father-in-law Miguel, titled The Letter That Changed America. The book had become required reading in military leadership courses and was being adapted into a major motion picture directed by Academy Award winner Maria Santos, the same woman David had helped 20 years earlier when she was a young veteran facing her own inheritance battle. Sarah Chen, now in her second term as Surgeon General, had just announced the establishment of the Rodriguez Institute for Medical Ethics at Johns Hopkins, ensuring that patient autonomy and family dynamics would be studied and protected for generations to come. Mrs. Patterson, now 93 and the Foundation's historian emeritus, watched from her wheelchair with eyes that still sparkled with sharp intelligence. Her great-granddaughter, Emily Patterson, age 16, served as one of the Foundation's youth ambassadors, teaching other teenagers about the importance of documenting family histories and respecting elders' wishes. But perhaps the most significant presence was that of President Maria Gonzalez, the first Latina president in American history, who had risen from poverty with the help of a Rodriguez Fellowship scholarship. She had flown in specifically to announce the establishment of the Rodriguez Doctrine in American foreign policy, a commitment to helping other nations develop legal protections for military families and vulnerable populations. The principles demonstrated by David Rodriguez and taught by Miguel Rodriguez have become American principles, President Gonzalez declared. We now export not just democracy but the specific mechanisms that protect the dignity and rights of those who serve democracy. The anniversary celebration included the unveiling of the Rodriguez Archive, a digital repository containing over 50,000 documents, recordings and testimonies from families helped by the Foundation. Researchers from Harvard, Yale, and Oxford were studying the archive to understand how individual acts of courage could create systemic social change. Richard Steinberg, now 78 and professor emeritus at Penn State Law School, had spent his retirement years developing the Steinberg Doctrine, a legal framework requiring attorneys to verify the legitimacy of inheritance challenges before filing, with severe penalties for frivolous cases. The Rodriguez case taught me that a lawyer's first obligation is to justice, not to whoever can pay the fee, he often told his students. The week's events culminated in the dedication of the Miguel Rodriguez Peace Garden, a 10-acre expansion of the original memorial garden that now served as an international center for conflict resolution. The garden's design incorporated elements from cultures around the world, symbolizing how the universal principles of respect and dignity transcended national boundaries. As David walked through the Peace Garden during the quiet hour before dawn on the anniversary morning, he paused at the newest addition, a simple stone bench placed exactly where his truck had been parked 20 years earlier. The inscription read, "Here began a conversation about what we owe each other. Here continues a commitment to make that conversation eternal." His morning reflection was interrupted by the approach of a young woman in military uniform, carrying a folder that David recognized immediately. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Kim, granddaughter of the PBS producer who had first documented the Rodriguez story, was facing her own inheritance challenge from family members who questioned her decision to pursue a military career, instead of joining the family business. "Miss Rodriguez," she said, "I have all the documentation you taught us to keep. My grandmother's wishes are clear, and my family's harassment is well documented. But I wanted to thank you in person before I file the countersuit." David smiled, remembering similar conversations with thousands of service members over the past 2 decades. "Commander Kim, you don't need to thank me, you're carrying forward the same principles your grandmother documented. The work belongs to all of us now." As they walked toward the Foundation headquarters, David reflected on the conversation he'd had with Sophia the night before. She had asked him a question that had been on his mind for months. "Uncle David, what happens when you're ready to retire? Who takes over?" The answer had become clear during the week's celebrations. The work no longer belonged to any single person or even any single organization. The Rodriguez principles had been incorporated into military training, legal education, medical ethics, and family counseling programs worldwide. They had become part of the institutional DNA of how democratic societies protected their most vulnerable members. That afternoon, David made an announcement that surprised everyone, including himself, until the moment he said it. "After 20 years of leading this foundation, I'm stepping down as director. But I'm not retiring from the work. I'm returning to where it all started, helping individual families, one case at a time, in the little office in my grandfather's house." The decision felt right in a way that organizational leadership never had. David had always been most comfortable working directly with people facing impossible situations, finding solutions through patience and preparation, rather than managing the global movement that had grown around those simple principles. As the anniversary celebrations concluded and visitors from around the world returned to their homes, David found himself once again sitting on Miguel's front porch, watching the sunset paint the Pennsylvania hills in familiar shades of gold and amber. In his pocket, he still carried Miguel's letter, now protected by museum-quality preservation, but worn thin from 2 decades of handling. The words had long since been memorized, but their power remained undiminished. "Make it a home again. Make me proud." Looking out at the lights beginning to twinkle in the expanded complex of buildings, at the gardens where children still learned to tend vegetables, at the Peace Pavilion where former enemies now worked side by side, David whispered the same words he'd spoken every evening for 20 years, "Mission accomplished, Abulau." But the work continued. Somewhere in the distance a phone was ringing in the Foundation's 24-hour help center, where a volunteer would answer and say the words that had become a promise heard around the world. "Rodriguez Foundation, how can we help your family?" The echo had indeed become eternal, but it remained as personal and immediate as one grandfather's love for the grandson who would take care of things properly. Some stories end, some stories become legends, and some stories become the foundation upon which all future stories are built. The Rodriguez story had become all three, proving that when love is documented, courage is prepared, and principles are lived without compromise, the ripples can reshape the world, one family at a time, forever. 25 years after Miguel Rodriguez penned his final letter, the farmhouse at 827 Maple Ridge Road welcomed a visitor who would have made the old man smile with recognition and pride. 8-year-old Miguel Rodriguez Washington, named for his great-great-grandfather and carrying the legacy in his very DNA, walked through the memorial garden with the careful steps of a child who understood he was in a sacred place. His father, General Marcus Rodriguez, now 34 and recently appointed Secretary of Veterans Affairs, watched with quiet emotion as his son touched the bronze statue of Miguel with the same reverence David had shown throughout his life. The boy had grown up hearing stories of the great-grandfather he'd never met, but who had shaped every aspect of his family's destiny. "Tell me again about the letter, Papa," Miguel Washington said, settling onto the stone bench where thousands of families had found hope over the past quarter-century. Marcus pulled out his phone and opened the digital archive that now contained not just Miguel's original letter, but thousands of similar documents from families around the world, who had learned to protect their wishes through proper documentation and unwavering principle. "Your great-great-grandfather wrote these words in 2022, Marcus began, his voice carrying the same measured tone that had made him such an effective military leader. He said, "This house has been in our family for 60 years, you were the light of my life after your parents passed. The house is yours now, Make it a home again. Make me proud. Young Miguel nodded solemnly. At 8, he already understood that family stories weren't just entertainment, they were instruction manuals for how to live with honor and purpose. The boy's visit coincided with a milestone that would have astounded anyone present during that first confrontation 25 years earlier. The Rodriguez Foundation had just celebrated helping its one. The achievement was marked not with fanfare, but with the quiet satisfaction that came from work done properly and principles maintained consistently. David Rodriguez, now 59 and serving as the foundation's senior family advocate, had returned to his preferred role of working directly with individual cases. His office in Miguel's original farmhouse had become something of a pilgrimage site for military families facing impossible situations, but David treated each visitor with the same careful attention he'd learned from his grandfather. This morning's visitor was Colonel Jennifer Adams, a decorated Air Force pilot, whose deployment to Eastern Europe had been extended just as her grandmother's health declined. Family members were challenging the elderly woman's will, claiming that Jennifer's absence during the final months proved she didn't deserve the family farm that had been promised to her since childhood. Colonel Adams, David said, reviewing the documentation she'd brought, "Your grandmother's video testimony is remarkably clear. She specifically addresses your military service, explaining that your deployment represents exactly the kind of sacrifice and dedication she wanted to honor." Jennifer's eyes filled with tears. "My cousins say I abandoned the family to play pilot. They claim Grandma only left me the farm because she was confused by her medications." David smiled, remembering similar words from 25 years earlier. "Your grandmother's medical records show complete cognitive clarity. Her doctor has provided a sworn statement about her mental capacity, and most importantly, you have 18 months of recorded conversations where she consistently explains her decision." As they worked through Jennifer's case, David reflected on how the patterns remained depressingly consistent. Military families still faced harassment from relatives who viewed service as abandonment rather than sacrifice. The difference was that now there were systems in place, legal protections, documentation protocols and advocacy networks that had grown from Miguel's simple desire to leave his house to someone who would take care of it properly. The Rodriguez Legal Protection Network now included over 5,000 attorneys across all 50 states, each trained in the specific challenges military families face. The Rodriguez documentation protocol had been refined through thousands of cases, creating an almost unbreachable legal framework for protecting legitimate inheritances. But perhaps the most significant change was culture. Military service was now widely recognized as a form of family contribution rather than family abandonment. The Rodriguez case had sparked a national conversation about what it meant to serve one's family, whether through physical presence or through the broader service of protecting democratic values. Sofia Rodriguez Chen, now Supreme Allied Commander for NATO and widely considered a candidate for future Secretary of Defense, had written extensively about this cultural shift. Her book Service as Love, Redefining Family Obligation in a Democratic Society, had become required reading in military academies worldwide. Uncle David changed how America thinks about military families, Sophia had explained in a recent interview. Before the Rodriguez case, military service was often seen as a selfish choice that took people away from family obligations. Now it's understood as the ultimate expression of family love, protecting the freedom that allows families to exist and thrive. The afternoon brought news that would have seemed impossible 25 years earlier. The United Nations had voted unanimously to adopt the Rodriguez Principles as part of international human rights law. The resolution required all member nations to establish legal protections for military families and vulnerable populations facing inheritance harassment. Tony Rodriguez, now 62 and serving as the Foundation's ambassador for international relations, called David with the news from the UN headquarters in New York. "Miguel's letter is now officially part of international law," Tony said, his voice thick with emotion. The resolution specifically cites the Rodriguez precedent as the foundation for protecting service members' family rights. That evening, as 3 generations of the Rodriguez family gathered for dinner in Miguel's old dining room, the conversation turned to the question that had been on everyone's mind:
What would the next 25 years? Young Miguel Washington, despite his age, offered an insight that surprised the adults. Maybe the next part isn't about helping more families, he said thoughtfully. Maybe it's about making sure no families need help anymore. David looked at his great-nephew with new respect. What do you mean? Well, the boy continued, if everyone learns to document things properly and treat military families with respect, then maybe there won't be any more bad people trying to steal houses from soldiers. The simplicity and wisdom of the observation struck everyone silent. After 25 years of reactive advocacy, helping families after they'd been attacked, perhaps the next phase should focus on proactive prevention. Dr. Rachel Kim, now director of the Rodriguez Institute for Conflict Prevention, had been working on exactly this concept. Her research suggested that communities with strong veteran integration programs and family documentation education had virtually eliminated inheritance harassment cases. Miguel Washington might be onto something, she said during a video call with the family that evening. What if we shifted from treating the disease to preventing it entirely? The idea sparked a new vision for the foundation's future. Instead of waiting for families to be attacked and then defending them, perhaps they could create communities where such attacks became unthinkable, where military service was so respected and family documentation so thorough that predatory relatives would have no opportunity or incentive to strike. As the family discussed this possibility, David felt a familiar stirring, the same sense of purpose that had driven him to stand up to Vanessa 25 years earlier. But this time, the vision was even grander, not just protecting individual families, but transforming society itself. Mrs. Patterson, now 98, and still sharp despite her age, offered the perspective that came with having witnessed the entire transformation. Miguel Rodriguez wanted his house to go to someone who would take care of it properly, she said from her wheelchair at the head of the table. But maybe what he really wanted was for his values to be passed on to people who would take care of the world properly. Looking around the table at generals and ambassadors, doctors and advocates, all united by the principles of one steel mill worker who had believed in doing the right thing, David realized that Miguel's true inheritance wasn't the house at all. It was the understanding that when you stand up for what's right with preparation, dignity and unwavering love, you don't just solve one problem, you teach others how to solve all the problems that follow. The work was far from over, but for the first time in 25 years, David could envision a future where the work might actually succeed completely, where Miguel's values became so deeply embedded in society that they would protect themselves, passing from generation to generation, like the most precious inheritance of all. The boy named Miguel Washington was right. The next chapter wouldn't be about helping more families. It would be about making sure every family understood they were already protected by the love, courage, and wisdom of those who came before them. 30 years after Miguel Rodriguez first picked up his pen to write his final letter, the transformation young Miguel Washington had envisioned was taking shape in ways that defied even the most optimistic prediction. The shift from reactive defense to proactive prevention had sparked a revolution in how communities approached family relationships, military service, and the fundamental question of what people owed each other. The morning sun cast long shadows across the grounds of what was now officially known as the Miguel Rodriguez International Center for Family Justice, but locals still called it simply the Rodriguez Place. David Rodriguez at 64 moved with the careful deliberation of someone whose body bore the accumulated weight of 3 decades of service, but whose mind remained as sharp and focused as the day he first faced down Vanessa's legal threat. Today marked the launch of the most ambitious project in the Foundation's history, the Community Transformation Initiative, designed to create Rodriguez communities, places where the principles of respect, documentation, and family honor were so deeply embedded that inheritance harassment became not just unlikely, but unthinkable. The pilot program was being launched simultaneously in 50 communities across America, each carefully selected to represent different demographics, economic conditions, and military population. The goal was both simple and revolutionary: to prove that the values Miguel Rodriguez had lived by, could become the foundation for how entire communities operated. Emily Patterson Chen, now 26 and the Foundation's Director of Community Integration, represented the fourth generation to be shaped by Miguel's legacy. Her great-grandmother, Mrs. Patterson, who had passed peacefully the previous winter at 103, had lived to see her great-granddaughter become a PhD in social psychology with a specialty in community transformation. Patterson always said that the Rodriguez story succeeded because it started with one family doing the right thing, Emily explained to the assembled representatives from the 50 pilot community. Our research shows that communities can be transformed the same way, one family at a time, but all at once. The Community Transformation Initiative was built on 5 pillars, each derived from lessons learned during 30 years of the Rodriguez experience: documentation, education. Every family and participating communities would receive free training in proper documentation of wills, medical decisions, and family wishes. The goal was to make every household legally bulletproof against inheritance harassment. Military family integration. Communities would establish formal support networks for military families, ensuring that deployment was viewed as community service, rather than family abandonment. Veterans would be integrated into leadership roles, with their military skills valued in civilian context. Conflict resolution networks. Trained mediators using techniques developed from thousands of Rodriguez Foundation cases would be available to help families resolve disputes before they became legal battles. Youth leadership development. Children and teenagers would be taught the principles of respect, documentation, and family honor through school programs, community service projects, and mentorship with military family. Economic support systems. Communities would establish funds to help military families facing legal challenges, ensuring that economic intimidation could never override legitimate inheritance rights. The first pilot community to report results was Millfield, Ohio, a town of 8,000 people with a large population of National Guard family. Mayor Patricia Williams, herself a Navy veteran, had enthusiastically embraced the Rodriguez model after her own family faced inheritance challenges when her grandfather, a Korean War veteran, left his farm to her instead of her civilian brother. 6 months ago, we had 3 separate inheritance disputes involving military families, Mayor Williams reported via video conference. Since implementing the Rodriguez protocols, we've had 0 new disputes and successfully mediated the existing one. More importantly, we've seen a fundamental shift in how the community views military service. The transformation in Millfield had been remarkable. Local businesses now offered automatic military family discounts. The high school had established a military family honor society. The town's annual festival now featured a documentation day, where families could receive free legal assistance in preparing wills and advance directives. But perhaps most significantly, the cultural change had been profound. Military deployment was now viewed as a community honor. Families, whose members served overseas, were supported by neighborhood networks that helped with childcare, home maintenance, and elder care. The idea that military service represented family abandonment had become not just unpopular but genuinely incomprehensible to community members. Similar results were being reported from pilot communities across the country. In rural Texas, inheritance disputes involving military families had dropped to 0. In suburban California, a community that had previously seen military families as transient outsiders, now elected a Marine veteran as mayor. In urban Michigan, a neighborhood association had established a fund specifically to support military families facing legal harassment. The success was so dramatic that the initiative caught the attention of international observers. Dr. Hans Müller, a sociologist from the University of Vienna, who was studying American community development, spent 3 months embedded in the pilot communities. What the Rodriguez Foundation has accomplished defies conventional understanding of social change, Müller reported to the European Union's Committee on Social Innovation. They have created a replicable model for transforming fundamental community values within a single generation. The international interest led to the most significant expansion of the Rodriguez model yet, the Global Community Transformation Project. Working with the United Nations, NATO, and various international development organizations, the Foundation began adapting the Community Transformation Initiative for deployment in countries around the world. The first international pilot was launched in rural Canada, where military families faced similar inheritance challenges. The second was established in Australia, working with Aboriginal communities to document and protect traditional land rights. The third was implemented in rural England, focusing on protecting the inheritance rights of British military families. But perhaps the most ambitious international project was the partnership with post-conflict zones in Eastern Europe, where the Rodriguez model was being used to help communities rebuild social trust and establish legal protections for vulnerable populations. General Sofia Rodriguez Chen, now serving her second term as NATO's Supreme Allied Commander, had become the driving force behind the international expansion. Her unique perspective as both a military leader and someone who had grown up in the shadow of the Rodriguez story made her the perfect ambassador for the model. What began as my uncle defending his inheritance has become a blueprint for how democratic societies can protect their most vulnerable members, General Rodriguez Chen explained during a speech at the World Economic Forum. The Rodriguez principles, preparation, documentation, respect for service, and unwavering commitment to doing what's right, these aren't just American values, they're human values that can strengthen any community willing to embrace them. The expansion wasn't without challenge. Some communities resisted the idea that their traditional approaches to family relationships needed changing. Others worried that the Rodriguez model was too American-centric to work in different cultural contexts, but the results spoke for themselves. In every community where the full Rodriguez model was implemented, inheritance disputes involving military families virtually disappeared. More importantly, communities reported improved social cohesion, stronger support networks for vulnerable populations, and a renewed sense of shared value. Young Miguel Washington, now 13 and already showing the thoughtful leadership that seemed to run in the Rodriguez bloodline, had been following the expansion with keen interest. During a family gathering at the original farmhouse, he asked the question that had been on everyone's mind.
2 years after that October morning, when David first pulled into the driveway at 847 Maple Ridge Road, the house had become something Miguel Rodriguez could never have imagined. A symbol of hope for veterans across the country. The documentary crew from PBS had been filming for 3 days, capturing the daily rhythms of life at what they called the house that changed everything. Producer Rachel Kim, a veteran herself who had served in Afghanistan, wanted to tell the complete story, not just the confrontation that made headlines, but the quiet work of building community that followed. Tell me about the moment you realized this was bigger than just your family. Rachel asked David as they sat in Miguel's old workshop, now converted into an office, where David managed the Rodriguez Veterans Advocacy Foundation. David looked out the window at the memorial garden, where Mrs. Paterson was teaching a group of local children how to tend the vegetables Miguel had loved. Probably when Senator Coleman called to tell me the Veteran Inheritance Protection Act had passed. She said our documentation had provided the legal framework that protected thousands of service members from harassment over legitimate inheritances. The act, signed into law 6 months earlier, provided federal legal resources for veterans facing frivolous will contests, and established penalties for lawyers who pursued inheritance challenges without merit. Richard Steinberg, ironically, had become one of the law's strongest advocates after seeing how unprepared he'd been for David's thorough documentation. The Rodriguez case taught me that my job as an attorney isn't just to file papers for whoever pays me, Steinberg had testified before Congress. It's to ensure that justice is served, especially for those who've served our country. Rachel's camera captured the afternoon ritual that had become central to the foundation's work. Every Tuesday and Thursday, David held documentation workshops in the community center, teaching veterans and their families how to properly record end-of-life decisions and protect inheritance rights. Today's workshop included 15 participants ranging from a 23-year-old Marine recently returned from deployment to an 82-year-old Korean War veteran, helping his grandson navigate a complex family situation. The key, David explained to the group, isn't just recording conversation. It's creating a comprehensive record that shows ongoing mental competency, clear decision-making, and consistent intent over time. Maria Santos, the young veteran from Texas whom David had helped 2 years earlier, now served as the foundation's regional coordinator. Her case had become the second major victory under the Rodriguez documentation method, and she'd used her legal success to help dozens of other veterans facing similar challenges. "David saved my grandmother's house and probably my sanity," Maria told the PBS camera. "But more than that, he showed me that military skills, organization, attention to detail, strategic thinking, those aren't just for combat, they're tools for building the life you want in civilian world." The foundation had grown beyond inheritance issues to address broader challenges facing transitioning veterans. Tony Rodriguez, now the foundation's operations director, had developed programs for veterans interested in historic preservation, construction trades, and small business ownership. "My brother taught me that having the skills isn't enough," Tony explained during his interview. "You also need the confidence to use them, and the support system to back you up when things get difficult." The afternoon workshop was interrupted by a phone call that would mark another milestone in the foundation's evolution. David stepped outside to take the call, returning with news that left the group speechless. "That was the White House," David announced. "The president wants to present the foundation with the Presidential Citizens Medal for our work supporting veteran families." The room erupted in cheers, but David held up his hand for quiet. "The ceremony is in 3 weeks, and Miguel's picture will be included in the display because the president's staff said this all started with one man's decision to leave his house to the grandson, who would take care of it properly." Mrs. Patterson, now 75 and the foundation's unofficial historian, wiped tears from her eyes. "Miguel would have been so proud. He always said that doing the right thing had a way of spreading like ripples in a pond." The PBS crew captured the evening celebration as the community gathered at the house for an impromptu barbecue. Commander Harrison brought the American Legion Honor Guard to raise the flag that now flew permanently over the property. Frank Morrison arrived with enough lumber to start the next day's project, building accessible ramps for the community center. Sarah Chen, who had become the foundation's medical advisor, brought news of her own. "The Rodriguez documentation protocol is being adopted by hospitals in 12 states. We're preventing family conflicts before they start by ensuring that patients' wishes are properly recorded and legally protected." As the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills, David found himself standing in the same spot where he'd confronted Vanessa 2 years earlier. The transformation was profound, not just of the property, but of everything that had grown from that moment of standing firm for what was right. Sofia Rodriguez, now 11, approached with a school project she'd been working on, a report titled "How My Uncle Changed the Law." Her research had uncovered something that surprised even David. Similar inheritance harassment cases involving veterans had dropped by 67% in states where the Rodriguez documentation method was being used. "Uncle David," Sofia said, "my teacher wants to know if you'll come speak to our class about how one person can make a difference." David smiled, thinking about Miguel's letter still carried in his wallet, now reinforced with tape from years of handling. "Tell your teacher I'd be honored, but I'll need to bring some help." This was never just one person's story. The evening wound down with the traditional gathering in Miguel's workshop, where veterans of different generations shared stories and offered support to those still transitioning to civilian life. Tonight's group included a Navy veteran struggling with PTSD, a recently divorced Army sergeant facing a custody battle, and an Air Force mechanic trying to start her own business. "The thing about serving your country," David told the group, "is that the service doesn't end when you take off the uniform, it just takes different forms." Commander Harrison nodded in agreement. Miguel Rodriguez served his community for 60 years, in the factory, on the school board, as a neighbor who helped anyone who needed it. David learned that service from him, and now he's teaching all of us. As the group dispersed, Tony lingered to help David clean up. "You know what Miguel would say if he could see all this?" David smiled, remembering his grandfather's voice. "He'd probably say we're making too big a deal out of just doing what's right. And then, he'd ask if we'd remembered to water the tomato." The brothers laughed, walking together toward the memorial garden where Miguel's favorite plants grew under the Pennsylvania star. The house at 8407 Maple Ridge Road had become exactly what Miguel had envisioned when he wrote his final letter, a place where family gathered, where values were taught, and where the next generation learned that some things were worth fighting for. But it had become something more as well, proof that when one person stands up for what's right, with preparation, dignity, and unwavering principle, the ripples can change the world. In his office, David kept a framed copy of Miguel's last letter next to the Presidential Citizens Medal announcement. The two documents together told the complete story: one man's simple wish that his house go to someone who would take care of it properly, and the extraordinary chain of events that followed when his grandson had the courage to honor that wish. The restoration was complete, the foundation was thriving, and the legacy was secure. But every morning, David still walked through the house Miguel had left him, touching the walls his grandfather had painted, walking the floors his grandfather had laid, and remembering the lesson that had started it all. Home isn't just a place you inherit, it's a place you build, day by day, choice by choice, with the people who choose to stand beside you, and sometimes, if you're very fortunate, that building becomes a foundation for others to build upon, creating something that lasts far longer than any single lifetime. The work continued. 5 years after David Rodriguez first pulled into the driveway at 8407 Maple Ridge Road, he stood before the largest gathering the property had ever seen. The occasion was the dedication of the Miguel Rodriguez Center for Veteran Family Services, a state-of-the-art facility built on the 3 acres that had once been just a farmhouse and a dream. Governor Patricia Walsh delivered the keynote address to an audience of over 500 people, including veterans, family members, community leaders, and federal officials. The Rodriguez Center represents something uniquely American, the governor declared. The idea that one person's courage to do what's right can inspire a movement that changes lives across our nation. David watched from the front row, flanked by Tony and his children, now teenagers who had grown up understanding that their family name carried both privilege and responsibility. Sophia, at 16, was already accepted to Penn State's architecture program with a full scholarship funded by the foundation. Marcus, 14, split his time between construction projects and volunteering at the local animal shelter, still undecided about his future but certain about his value. Mrs. Patterson, now 78 but still sharp as a tack, sat in the place of honor with Miguel's framed photograph beside her. She had become the foundation's chief storyteller, ensuring that every new volunteer understood the simple beginning that had led to this moment. The center itself was a marvel of sustainable architecture, designed by Sophia as her senior project and built largely by veteran volunteers using techniques David had developed during the original farmhouse restoration. Solar panels provided clean energy, rainwater collection systems watered the expanded memorial garden, and every piece of reclaimed wood told a story of renewal and purpose. Richard Steinberg, now the foundation's legal counsel, approached the podium for his portion of the ceremony. The transformation of the lawyer who had once threatened David with frivolous litigation was perhaps the most remarkable personal journey in the entire story. 5 years ago, I made the mistake of underestimating David Rodriguez, Steinberg began, his voice carrying genuine humility. I thought legal intimidation could overcome moral authority. I learned that when someone is truly prepared, not just with documents but with conviction, no amount of legal posturing can shake them. Steinberg's law firm now specialized in protecting veteran inheritance rights and had established a pro bono program that provided free legal services to military families facing harassment. The Rodriguez case taught me that being a lawyer isn't about winning arguments, he continued. It's about serving justice, especially for those who've served our country. The ceremony's most emotional moment came when Maria Santos, now the foundation's national director, read letters from the 84-7 families they had helped over the past 5 years. Each story was different: contested wills, property disputes, custody battles complicated by deployment schedules, but all shared common themes of preparation, dignity, and the power of having someone believe in your cause. David Rodriguez didn't just save my grandmother's house, one letter read. He taught me that military service gives us tools for civilian battles too. Organization, attention to detail, strategic thinking, these aren't just combat skills, they're life skills. Sarah Chen, who had traveled from Johns Hopkins where she now directed a national program for medical documentation standards, spoke about the broader impact on healthcare. The Rodriguez documentation protocol has been adopted by over 200 hospitals nationwide. We're preventing thousands of family conflicts by ensuring that patients' end-of-life wishes are properly recorded and legally protected. Commander Harrison, now retired but still serving as the Foundation's volunteer coordinator, announced the latest milestone. The Rodriguez method had been incorporated into transition programs at military bases across the country, teaching service members how to protect their families from legal harassment while they served overseas. The dedication concluded with the unveiling of the center's central feature, a bronze statue of Miguel Rodriguez, sitting on his front porch, reading a letter. The inscription read simply, "In memory of Miguel Rodriguez, 1932-2022, who taught us that home is built with love, protected with courage, and shared with community." As the crowd dispersed for the reception, David found himself approached by a young Marine corporal named James Washington, recently returned from deployment in Eastern Europe. "Mr. Rodriguez," the Marine said, "my grandmother passed while I was overseas. My cousins are claiming she was mentally incompetent when she left me her farm. They say I don't deserve it, because I've been playing soldier instead of staying home to help the family." David smiled sadly, recognizing the familiar pattern. "Corporal Washington, let's walk to my office. I have some forms you'll need to fill out, and I'll connect you with one of our attorneys." As they walked toward the original farmhouse, now serving as the Foundation's headquarters, David reflected on how many times he'd had this exact conversation. The details changed, but the underlying story remained depressingly consistent. Families trying to use legal intimidation to override the wishes of elderly relatives who dared to honor service members. "The thing is," Corporal Washington continued, "I recorded every phone call with my grandmother for the past 2 years. She always said she wanted me to have the farm because I was the only grandchild who understood the value of hard work and sacrifice." David stopped walking and looked at the young Marine with new respect. "You already know about documentation." "Yes, sir. Every Marine gets briefed on the Rodriguez protocol now before deployment. They tell us it's named after a veteran who refused to let bullies steal his inheritance, and ended up changing federal law." David felt a familiar warmth in his chest, the same feeling he'd experienced when Miguel first told him the house would be his. The work was continuing, spreading beyond what any one person could accomplish. That evening, as the last guest departed and the cleanup crews finished their work, David sat on the front porch of the original farmhouse with Tony, their children, and Mrs. Patterson. The bronze statue of Miguel caught the last rays of sunlight, and the memorial garden rustled gently in the evening breeze. "Abuelo would be amazed," Sophia said, looking out at the complex of buildings that had grown from his simple farmhouse. All this from one old man's decision to leave his house to the right person. "Not just the right person," Mrs. Patterson corrected gently, "the person who would do the right thing with it." David pulled Miguel's letter from his wallet, now laminated for protection but still carried everywhere he went. The words were memorized, but he still read them aloud whenever the family gathered like this. "Micho, this house has been in our family for 60 years. I bought it with my first paycheck from the factory, dreaming of the family I'd raise here. You were the light of my life after your parents passed. The house is yours now. Make it a home again. Make me proud." "Mission accomplished, Abuelo," David said quietly to the evening sky. Tony nodded toward the center's main building, where lights still glowed in the offices where staff members worked late preparing for the next day's cases. "He probably never imagined it would grow this big." "I don't think he cared about the size," David replied. "He cared about the principle. Stand up for what's right, take care of your family, and leave the world a little better than you found it." Marcus, now tall enough to look his uncle in the eye, asked the question that had been on his mind all day. "Uncle David, what happens when you're too old to run the foundation? Who takes over?" David looked around at the next generation, Sophia with her architectural dreams, Marcus with his careful consideration of every decision, Tony's quiet leadership that had grown stronger over the year.
and dozens of other young veterans whose lives had been touched by Miguel's simple act of faith. The work doesn't belong to any one person, David said. It belongs to everyone who believes that doing the right thing matters more than taking the easy path. As the family prepared to head inside, David took one last look at the bronze statue of his grandfather. Miguel Rodriguez had bought a simple farmhouse with dreams of raising a family. He had raised a grandson who would honor those dreams and expand them into something that served thousands of families. The house at 8047 Maple Ridge Road had become a symbol, the foundation had become a movement, and the simple principle of standing up for what's right had become a legacy that would outlast them all. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new families in need of help, new opportunities to prove that courage and preparation could overcome intimidation and injustice. But tonight, on the front porch where it all began, David Rodriguez was simply a grandson who had kept his promise to make his grandfather proud. The restoration was complete, the foundation was thriving, the legacy was secure, and the work would continue, carried forward by everyone who understood that home isn't just a place you inherit, it's a place you build, defend, and share with others who need a foundation for their own dream. In the end, that was Miguel Rodriguez's greatest gift, not just a house, but the example of how one person's principles, when lived with courage and shared with love, can change the world. 10 years after David Rodriguez first inserted his key into the lock at 8047 Maple Ridge Road, the story had taken on a life far beyond what anyone could have imagined. What began as a simple inheritance dispute had evolved into something approaching American folklore, the kind of story told in military barracks, law schools, and family dinners across the nation. The occasion marking this anniversary was unlike any previous gathering. Representatives from all 50 states had come to Pennsylvania for the first National Veteran Family Rights Convention, hosted at the Miguel Rodriguez Center. The agenda included policy workshops, legal training sessions, and testimonials from families whose lives had been changed by the principles David had first demonstrated on that autumn morning, a decade ago. David, now 44 and bearing the quiet dignity of someone who had seen his life's work exceed his wildest expectations, served as the convention's opening speaker. His hair showed touches of gray at the temples, and the lines around his eyes spoke of years spent listening to difficult stories and finding solutions for impossible situations. 10 years ago, David began, addressing the packed auditorium. I thought I was just trying to keep a house my grandfather left me. I had no idea I was beginning a conversation about respect, dignity, and what we owe to those who serve our country. In the audience sat hundreds of people whose lives had been touched by the Rodriguez legacy. There was Dr. Patricia Kim, a Navy veteran who had used the documentation protocol to protect her father's restaurant from greedy relatives. Robert Chen, an Army sergeant who had secured his grandmother's college fund for his children despite family members who claimed military service was just a job. Sarah Williams, an Air Force captain whose deployment photos had become crucial evidence in proving her great-aunt's mental competency when making her will. But perhaps the most significant presence in the room was Vanessa Rodriguez herself, now 52 and bearing little resemblance to the angry woman who had screamed at David on his front porch. She had requested permission to address the convention, and David had agreed, understanding that redemption stories were often the most powerful of all. I stand before you today, Vanessa said when called to the podium, as someone who represents everything this movement stands against. 10 years ago I let jealousy, entitlement, and frankly ignorance about military service drive me to attack a good man who was honoring his grandfather's wishes. The auditorium was silent as she continued, her voice steady but emotional. I spent 3 years in therapy after my divorce, trying to understand why I had become the kind of person who could scream at a veteran that he didn't deserve respect. What I learned was that my anger wasn't really about the house. It was about my own insecurities and my failure to understand what service and sacrifice actually mean. Vanessa had spent the past 5 years working with military families as a volunteer, helping spouses navigate the challenges of deployment and reintegration. David Rodriguez didn't just defend his inheritance that day, she said. He defended the principle that service matters, that sacrifice deserves respect, and that families should honor the wishes of their elders rather than their own greed. Her speech received a standing ovation, but more importantly, it demonstrated the transformative power of the principles Miguel Rodriguez had instilled in his grandson, that even former enemies could become allies when treated with dignity and given the opportunity for growth. The convention's second day featured the announcement that would cement the Rodriguez legacy in American history. Senator Patricia Coleman, now chair of the Armed Services Committee, revealed that Congress had unanimously passed the Miguel Rodriguez Memorial Act, establishing a permanent federal office dedicated to protecting military families from inheritance harassment and legal intimidation. The Rodriguez Documentation Protocol will now be taught in every law school in America, Senator Coleman announced, and the Miguel Rodriguez Fellowship will provide full college scholarships to children of military families who have faced inheritance challenges. Tony Rodriguez, now 47 and serving as the foundation's executive director, had tears in his eyes as he watched his brother receive recognition he had never sought but richly deserved. Tony's own journey from insurance salesman to national advocate had been remarkable, but he always credited David with showing him that real success meant building something that served others. Sofia Rodriguez, now 21 and in her final year at Penn State, had already been accepted to graduate programs at both Harvard and Stanford. Her senior thesis, Architecture as Community Building Lessons from the Rodriguez Center, had been selected for publication by the American Institute of Architects. But more importantly, she had announced her intention to spend her gap year working with the foundation, designing community centers for military families in underserved areas. Marcus Rodriguez, at 19, had chosen a different path but one equally rooted in service. He was completing his freshman year at the U.S. Military Academy at West Point, planning to follow his uncle's footsteps into the Army Corps of Engineers. "Uncle David taught me that military service isn't about fighting," he had explained to the family. "It's about building things that make the world better." Mrs. Patterson, now 83, but still volunteering at the center 3 days a week, had become something of a national treasure. Her memoir, Watching History Happen, A Neighbor's View of the Rodriguez Story, had become a bestseller, with all proceeds going to the foundation. Publishers had been amazed by the book's appeal across age groups and political affiliations. Apparently, stories about doing the right thing resonated with everyone. The convention's final ceremony took place at Miguel's grave in the small cemetery overlooking the valley. David had arranged for a new headstone, which read simply, "Miguel Rodriguez, 1932-2022. He taught us that home is built with love, protected with courage, and shared with community. His legacy lives in every family we serve." As David stood at his grandfather's grave, surrounded by hundreds of people whose lives had been changed by one old man's decision to leave his house to the grandson who would honor it properly, he reflected on the journey that had brought them all to this moment. Corporal James Washington, the young Marine David had helped 5 years earlier, approached with news that his own foundation was being established in North Carolina, using the Rodriguez model to serve rural military families. "You taught me that helping one person creates ripples," Washington said. "Now I'm teaching others the same lesson." Dr. Sarah Chen, now serving as Surgeon General, had implemented the Rodriguez documentation standards throughout the entire military medical system. "We're preventing family conflicts before they start," she told David. "Your grandfather's simple desire to protect his wishes has become a model for respecting patient autonomy nationwide." As the sun set over the Pennsylvania hills, David walked back toward the house where it all began. The original farmhouse still stood at the center of the expanded complex, carefully preserved as both museum and working office. Miguel's room remained exactly as he had left it, with his favorite chair positioned to look out at the memorial garden, where children still learned to tend the vegetables he had loved. In his office, David maintained the same simple desk where he had first spread out the legal documents that proved his ownership. On the wall hung Miguel's final letter, now recognized by the Smithsonian as a significant historical document. Next to it was a photograph from the White House ceremony, where President Martinez had presented David with the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the nation's highest civilian honor. but the items David treasured most were simpler. Thank you letters from families who had kept their inheritance, photos of children who had received Rodriguez Fellowship scholarships, and a worn copy of the documentation protocol that had been translated into 12 languages and was being used by military families around the world. As David prepared to lock up for the evening, his phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Mr. Rodriguez, my name is Lieutenant Sarah Foster, U.S. Navy. My grandmother passed while I was deployed in the Pacific. My family is threatening to contest her will because I've been playing sailor instead of staying home. I heard about your foundation. Can you help? David smiled, typing back immediately. Lieutenant Foster, you've come to the right place. Our office opens at 8 a.m. tomorrow. Bring any documentation you have, and we'll take care of the rest. You're not alone in this fight. He looked up at Miguel's portrait one final time before turning off the lights. Still taking care of your family, abuelo, just like you taught me. The house was quiet now, but the work continued. Somewhere across the country, military families slept peacefully, knowing their service was respected, and their sacrifices were honored. Children dreamed of futures made possible by scholarships funded through principles of dignity and justice. Lawyers learned to serve justice rather than just serve paper. And in a small cemetery overlooking the Pennsylvania hills, Miguel Rodriguez rested, knowing that his simple wish for his house to go to someone who would take care of it properly had become a movement that would take care of military families forever. The echo of one man's courage had become eternal, proving that when you stand up for what's right with preparation, dignity and unwavering love, the ripples truly never end.
Come up to the porch, Michael, David said, feeling the familiar stirring of purpose. Let's talk about documentation, dignity, and what it really means to honor your grandfather's wishes. As they talked into the evening, David realized that Miguel's letter had achieved something beyond even its most ambitious dreams. It hadn't just protected military families, it had created a template for protecting all vulnerable people from all forms of family harassment. The work would never truly be finished, because there would always be new challenges, new forms of vulnerability, new people who needed someone to stand with them against intimidation and injustice. But that was the beauty of it. Miguel Rodriguez had never intended to solve every problem. He had simply demonstrated that one person, with preparation, courage, and unwavering principle, could stand up to injustice and win. The lesson had taken root so deeply in human consciousness that it would bloom again and again, in every generation, whenever someone needed the courage to do what was right. As Michael Thompson drove away with his documentation plan and renewed confidence, David looked up at the stars that had witnessed 50 years of transformation. Somewhere among them, he imagined Miguel smiling at the knowledge that his simple wish, for his house to go to someone who would take care of it properly, had become humanity's promise to take care of everyone properly. The inheritance was complete, not just a house, not just money, not even just principles. Miguel Rodriguez had left humanity the most precious gift of all, the absolute certainty that when good people stand up for what's right with preparation, courage, and love, they cannot be defeated. That certainty would protect families forever, passed down like the most sacred inheritance from generation to generation, ensuring that Miguel's letter would echo through eternity. Make it a home again. Make me proud. Mission accomplished, abuelo. Forever and always. Mission
You've got
accomplished.
2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.